Hey, welcome back. Let everything quiet down and we'll ease into a slow tale from Roman history. In the quiet imagination of the modern world, the gods of Rome are often introduced as echoes. Their names feel familiar, their stories half known before they are told, as if they arrive already wearing borrowed clothes. Jupiter is called Zeus by another name. Venus is labeled Aphrodite in disguise. Mars is reduced to a harsher version of Ares. From a distance, it can seem as though Rome inherited a divine family fully formed, changing little more than pronunciation. Yet, this impression, repeated often enough, hides a more interesting truth. The Roman gods were not copied in the simple sense of imitation. They were translated, adapted, and reshaped by a society with very different priorities from those of Greece. To understand how Roman gods came to resemble Greek ones, it is necessary to begin with how Rome understood religion itself. Roman worship was not primarily a matter of telling stories about gods behaving like exaggerated humans. It was, at its core, practical. Religion existed to maintain balance between the human world and the unseen powers that governed it. If the proper rites were performed, if vows were kept and calendars respected, the gods would uphold order in return. The question was not whether a god was lovable or dramatic, but whether that god fulfilled their function. In early Rome, divine power was diffuse rather than theatrical. Sacred forces were present in fields, thresholds, crossroads, hearthfires, and the invisible boundaries that marked where one space ended and another began. Many of these forces were not imagined as fully personified beings with detailed myths. They were powers to be honored, addressed, and negotiated with. When Rome later encountered the richly narrated gods of Greece, it did not abandon this mindset. Instead, it asked a distinctly Roman question: which of these foreign gods performs the same role as one of ours? This process, later described by scholars as interpretatio, was not unique to Rome, but Rome applied it with remarkable consistency. When Romans met Greek culture, especially through trade and colonization in southern Italy, they did not see an alien religion. They saw a familiar system expressed through different names and stories. A Greek sky god who ruled through thunder could be aligned with Rome's own supreme sky god. A Greek goddess of wisdom and skill could be matched with a Roman deity who oversaw crafts and strategic thought. The match did not need to be perfect. It needed to be useful. This distinction matters because it explains why Roman gods, even when clearly linked to Greek predecessors, often feel different in character. Roman religion cared deeply about stability, law, and continuity. The gods were guardians of contracts, borders, marriages, harvests, and civic order. Greek myth, by contrast, often explored conflict, personality, and the emotional lives of the gods themselves. When Rome absorbed Greek mythological material, it filtered those stories through a system that valued control over chaos and function over drama. It is tempting to imagine this transformation as a single moment, as if Rome encountered Greece and instantly replaced its pantheon. In reality, the process unfolded slowly, over centuries. Rome's earliest religious practices developed long before Greek influence became dominant. These early practices were shaped by the rhythms of agriculture, family life, and warfare in central Italy. They were also influenced by neighboring cultures, especially the Etruscans, who acted as cultural intermediaries between Greece and Rome. By the time Greek myths began flowing steadily into Roman life, Rome already possessed a religious framework capable of absorbing them. The Roman state maintained priesthoods, sacred calendars, and public rituals that regulated when and how gods were honored. New gods, whether foreign or reinterpreted, were slotted into this structure. Their stories were adjusted to fit Roman expectations. Their cults were organized around Roman institutions. Even when a god retained a Greek narrative background, their role within Roman society could be significantly altered. This is why it is misleading to say that Rome merely borrowed Greek gods. Borrowing suggests passivity. Rome was anything but passive in matters of religion. The Romans believed that their success as a people was tied directly to their relationship with the divine. Military victories, political stability, and agricultural prosperity were all seen as signs that the gods were satisfied. When something went wrong, the response was not philosophical doubt, but ritual correction. A god had been neglected, misidentified, or improperly honored. Greek religion, for all its ritual complexity, often approached the gods through storytelling. Myths explained why the world was the way it was, how suffering entered human life, and why the gods behaved unpredictably. Roman religion, by contrast, approached the gods through obligation. Each god had a domain. Each domain required attention. Each attention required the correct words and actions. In this environment, Greek myths became raw material rather than sacred scripture. As Rome expanded, this method of religious translation became one of its most powerful tools. When Romans encountered new peoples, they did not typically outlaw local gods. Instead, they identified them. A local thunder god could be recognized as another face of Jupiter. A regional healing god could be associated with an existing Roman deity. This practice allowed Rome to integrate conquered territories without erasing their religious identities entirely. It also reinforced the Roman belief that their gods were universal, capable of manifesting under many names. Understanding Roman gods through their Greek origins, then, requires resisting the urge to start with Greece. It requires beginning with Rome's own religious instincts. The Romans did not seek gods who reflected human emotion. They sought gods who upheld order. When Greek gods entered this system, they were disciplined by it. Their excesses were softened or redirected. Their stories were edited to emphasize duty, lineage, and legitimacy. Even language reflects this shift. Greek gods are often remembered through tales of personal conflict, jealousy, love, betrayal, and revenge. Roman gods are remembered through titles and functions. Jupiter Optimus Maximus is not simply a thunderer. He is the best and greatest guardian of the state. Mars is not merely a violent figure. He is a protector of fields, fathers, and the Roman people themselves. Venus is not only a goddess of desire, she becomes a symbol of ancestry and destiny. This functional emphasis does not mean that Romans lacked imagination or storytelling. Roman poets, especially in the later Republic and early Empire, embraced Greek myth with enthusiasm. They retold ancient stories in Latin, adapted them to Roman values, and used them to explore political and moral questions. But these literary treatments existed alongside, not in place of, a ritual system that remained deeply conservative. Poetry could embellish, but ritual could not be careless. As a result, Roman religion developed a dual character. On one level, it was intensely traditional, governed by priests who guarded formulas and calendars with meticulous care. On another level, it was remarkably flexible, capable of absorbing new gods and new stories without collapsing. Greek mythology provided Rome with narrative richness, while Rome provided Greek gods with institutional permanence. The similarities between Roman and Greek gods are real, but they are not the whole story. Each Roman god discussed later carries traces of Greek influence, but also layers of Roman reinterpretation. To see only the Greek origin is to miss what Rome built on top of it. To see only the Roman name is to ignore the long cultural conversation that shaped it. From here, each major Roman god is approached from a Roman first perspective. Greek origins will be acknowledged where they genuinely apply, but always in service of understanding how Rome transformed those origins into something that fit its own sense of order, power, and destiny. What emerges is not a borrowed pantheon, but a carefully assembled one, shaped by centuries of negotiation between tradition and adaptation, ritual and story, Rome and the wider Mediterranean world. Long before Greek myths reached Roman ears, religion in Rome already existed as a quiet framework woven into daily life. It did not announce itself through epic stories or dramatic family trees of the gods. Instead, it lived in routines, gestures, and obligations that marked the passing of each day and season. To the Romans, the divine world was not distant or abstract. It was close, practical, and ever-present, embedded in the acts of farming, governing, marrying, and crossing from one space into another. Early Roman religion was shaped by survival and continuity. The people who settled along the Tiber were farmers, herders, and warriors, dependent on predictable seasons and stable social bonds. Their religious instincts reflected this reality. They did not initially imagine gods as vividly human personalities who quarreled and fell in love. They imagined powers that governed specific forces: growth, protection, boundaries, fertility, and decay. These powers required respect, not affection. What mattered most was maintaining good standing with them. Many of Rome's earliest sacred powers were known not as gods in the later sense, but as presences. These presences did not always have fixed forms or detailed stories. They were recognized through their effects. A successful harvest implied divine favor. A failed crop suggested neglect or error. Religion, in this early phase, functioned less as storytelling and more as careful management of unseen relationships. This outlook produced a religious culture centered on precision. Ritual words mattered, timing mattered, correct posture, offerings, and sequence mattered. A single mistake could invalidate an entire ceremony. This concern for accuracy reflected a broader Roman belief that order in human affairs mirrored order in the divine realm. If humans acted carelessly, the gods might respond in kind. The household stood at the center of this system. Family life was sacred, not in an abstract sense, but in daily practice. The hearth fire was more than a source of warmth. It was a living symbol of continuity between generations. Ancestors were remembered not as distant figures, but as participants in the present, watching over their descendants and requiring ongoing respect. Domestic religion tied the past, present, and future together in a single, unbroken chain. This focus on the household shaped how Romans understood community as well. The city itself was imagined as an extension of the family. Just as a home had a hearth and boundaries, so too did Rome as a whole. Sacred fires burned for the state. Borders were ritually defined. Gates and roads were treated as spiritually sensitive points where care was required. Moving through space was never neutral. It always involved crossing from one condition into another. Time was treated with the same seriousness as space. Days were not interchangeable. Some were appropriate for public business. Others were restricted. The calendar was a religious document, marking which moments were favorable and which were dangerous. Ignoring these distinctions risked disrupting the balance between humans and gods. Within this framework, gods were identified by what they did rather than by who they were as personalities. A power that protected boundaries was honored for that protection. A force that governed growth was respected for ensuring abundance. Names existed, but they were often secondary to function. Multiple names could even coexist, reflecting different aspects of the same power. This functional approach made early Roman religion remarkably flexible. Because gods were defined by roles, not rigid narratives, it was possible to recognize familiar roles in foreign deities. When Romans later encountered Greek gods with elaborate myths, they did not see competitors. They saw alternative expressions of functions they already understood. It is important to recognize that this early system did not vanish when Greek influence arrived. It remained the foundation upon which later developments were built. Even as Roman writers embraced Greek storytelling, ritual practice stayed conservative. Priests continued to guard ancient formulas. Public ceremonies continued to follow established patterns. The old instincts of caution and precision never disappeared. This continuity explains why Roman religion could absorb so much without losing its identity. Greek myths added color and drama, but they did not replace the underlying structure. Instead, they were layered onto it, interpreted through Roman priorities. The difference becomes especially clear when comparing attitudes toward divine behavior. Greek gods were often portrayed as unpredictable, driven by desire, jealousy, or pride. These stories explored the tension between divine power and human vulnerability. Roman religion, by contrast, emphasized reliability. The gods were expected to respond predictably if honored correctly. Unpredictability was not entertaining, it was dangerous. This expectation shaped how Romans judged religious success. A ritual that worked confirmed the system. A ritual that failed demanded investigation and correction. There was little room for irony or ambiguity. Religion was a serious affair because it was believed to directly affect the state's survival. As Rome grew from a collection of settlements into a city, and from a city into a regional power, these instincts scaled with it. What had once governed households now governed armies and provinces. The same principles applied: identify the relevant power, honor it correctly, maintain balance. This approach would later allow Rome to integrate gods from across the Mediterranean world. But before that expansion, it already defined what it meant to be Roman in religious terms. The gods existed to support order. Humans existed to maintain proper relations with them. Storytelling served this relationship, not the other way around. Understanding this early religious mindset is essential for understanding everything that follows. When Greek gods enter the Roman world, they do not arrive on neutral ground. They enter a system already shaped by centuries of ritual discipline, civic obligation, and practical concern for stability. Greek myth will soon provide Rome with new language, new imagery, and new ways of thinking about the divine. But the Roman instinct to prioritize function, duty, and continuity will remain firmly in place, quietly guiding how those myths are understood, adapted, and ultimately transformed. Before Greek myth fully entered Roman life, another culture stood between the two, quietly shaping how Rome would come to understand the gods. This culture was Etruria. The Etruscans occupied much of central Italy and, for centuries, exerted a deep influence on Rome's political institutions, religious habits, and sacred imagination. Their role in the development of Roman religion is easy to underestimate, largely because so much of what they gave to Rome was later absorbed so completely that it no longer appeared foreign. The Etruscans were not passive recipients of Greek culture, nor were they simple imitators. They were active participants in a Mediterranean world, where ideas, goods, and religious concepts traveled constantly. Greek traders and settlers reached Etruscan ports long before Rome became a major power. Through these contacts, Greek myths, artistic styles, and divine figures entered Etruscan society, where they were reworked to fit local traditions. When Rome rose under Etruscan influence, it inherited not only kings, symbols of authority, and engineering practices, but also a way of thinking about the divine. The Etruscans emphasized order, signs, and interpretation. For them, the gods communicated through patterns in nature, especially through lightning, the flight of birds, and unusual events. Divine will was not mysterious in the abstract sense. It was legible if one knew how to read it. This approach aligned naturally with Roman instincts. Romans, like the Etruscans, believed that the gods expressed approval or disapproval through observable signs. What the Etruscans provided was a highly developed system for decoding those signs. Divination became a structured discipline, taught, recorded, and passed down. Sacred knowledge was not improvised, it was inherited and guarded. Many of Rome's most characteristic religious offices reflect this Etruscan legacy. Priests trained to interpret omens, specialists consulted before major political or military decisions, and the belief that the gods must be formally consulted before action all owe much to Etruscan practice. This was not myth-driven religion, it was procedural. The Etruscans also provided Rome with early models for major gods, who would later be associated with Greek counterparts. Tinia, the Etruscan sky god, ruled through thunder and lightning and presided over cosmic order. Uni, a powerful goddess associated with sovereignty and protection, guarded marriage and civic stability. Menrava oversaw skill, wisdom, and strategic intelligence. These figures were already well established in central Italy, before Rome began deeply engaging with Greek literature. When Greek Zeus, Hera, and Athena later entered Roman consciousness, they did not arrive in an empty conceptual space. Rome already recognized a sky ruler, a sovereign goddess, and a divine patron of skill and strategy. The Greek gods could be aligned with these existing figures, not because they were identical, but because their functions overlapped. The Etruscan layer made this alignment feel natural, rather than disruptive. This helps explain why certain Roman gods feel more institutional than their Greek counterparts. Jupiter's authority is not merely personal, it is legal and cosmic. Juno's power is not confined to marital jealousy. It extends to protection of the Roman people as a whole. Minerva's wisdom is practical, tied to crafts, planning, and organized knowledge. These emphases reflect an inheritance filtered through Etruscan priorities. The Etruscan influence is especially visible in how Rome understood sacred law. Religious rules were not simply traditions. They were binding frameworks believed to be established by the gods themselves. Violating ritual law was not a private failing, but a public danger. This sense of collective responsibility for divine favor would become a defining feature of Roman state religion. Art and imagery also reveal this bridge between cultures. Etruscan art often depicts figures recognizable from Greek myth, but rendered with distinct local characteristics. Names change. Attributes shift. Scenes emphasize different moments. These visual adaptations show the process at work long before Roman poets put Greek stories into Latin verse. Crucially, the Etruscans normalized the idea that foreign gods could be integrated without undermining religious stability. If a divine power demonstrated effectiveness, it could be honored. The key requirement was proper recognition and correct ritual. Origin mattered less than function and reliability. This mindset prepared Rome for later religious expansion. When Greek gods arrived more fully through southern Italy and literary culture, Rome already possessed a tested method for incorporation. Identify the role. Align it with an existing divine function. Establish proper rites. Maintain balance. The Etruscans, then, were not merely a stepping stone to Greece. They were architects of Rome's religious confidence. They taught Rome that the divine world was ordered, interpretable, and responsive to correct action. Greek myth would later add narrative depth, but the structural confidence was already in place. As Etruscan political dominance faded and Rome asserted itself as an independent power, their religious influence did not disappear. It became embedded. Roman religion carried Etruscan discipline forward, even as it layered Greek stories on top. Understanding this Etruscan bridge prevents a common misunderstanding. Roman religion did not leap directly from rustic anonymity into Greek sophistication. It evolved through stages, each one reinforcing the idea that gods were partners in maintaining order, not distant figures to be admired from afar. When Greek gods finally entered Rome's religious life in force, they encountered a system already accustomed to translation, already trained to adapt without surrendering control. That encounter would transform Roman religion profoundly, but it would never erase the Etruscan lessons that taught Rome how to listen to the gods in the first place. As Rome's world widened beyond the hills of central Italy, contact with Greek religion shifted from distant influence to daily presence. This change did not arrive through conquest alone. It moved along trade routes through port cities, marketplaces, and shared dangers. Southern Italy, known to later writers as Magna Graecia, had been home to Greek-speaking communities for generations. By the time Rome encountered them in force, Greek gods were already rooted in Italian soil. In these southern cities, Greek temples stood openly, Greek rituals were performed regularly, and Greek myths were spoken as living tradition rather than foreign rumor. For Rome, this was a new situation. The gods of Greece were no longer abstract or mediated through Etruscan adaptation. They were visible, active, and apparently effective. Crops grew, cities prospered, oracles were consulted. The question was no longer whether Greek gods existed, but how they should be understood. Roman religion responded in its characteristic way. It did not reject these gods, nor did it surrender to them. It evaluated them. Were these powers reliable? Did they answer prayers? Did they maintain order when properly honored? If so, they could be acknowledged within Rome's existing religious framework. This period saw the first clear instances of Greek gods entering Roman public worship with minimal disguise. Apollo is the most striking example. Unlike other deities who were identified with Roman counterparts, Apollo entered Rome under his Greek name. This alone signals how Rome perceived him. He was not replacing an existing god. He was addressing a need that Rome believed required his specific power. Apollo's arrival was tied to crisis. Disease and uncertainty created a sense that existing rituals were insufficient. Consulting Greek sources, Rome adopted Apollo's cult as a corrective measure. His worship focused on healing, purification, and foresight. These were practical concerns, not literary ones. Apollo's myths mattered less than his perceived effectiveness. Even so, once adopted, Apollo was quickly absorbed into Roman order. His temples were administered by Roman priests. His festivals were placed on the Roman calendar. His role became defined by civic responsibility rather than mythic personality. Over time, Apollo would become associated with discipline, clarity, and restraint, qualities Rome admired deeply. Other Greek gods followed through similar channels. Oracles, especially those connected to Greek tradition, were consulted during moments of fear or transition. Sacred texts were imported, interpreted, and guarded by Roman authorities. These texts were not treated as storytelling devices, but as tools for managing divine relationships. Magna Graecia also introduced Rome to a different religious atmosphere. Greek worship was often more openly emotional, more narrative-driven, and more focused on individual devotion. Roman religion, by contrast, remained formal and collective. When Greek cults entered Rome, they were adjusted to fit public order. Excess was restrained. Ritual precision was emphasized. This process reveals an important pattern. Rome did not absorb Greek religion because it admired Greek culture in the abstract. It absorbed Greek gods when they solved problems. Religious adoption was pragmatic. If a god was believed to protect the city, heal the sick, or stabilize the future, that god was worth honoring. The flow of Greek religion into Rome accelerated as Rome expanded militarily into southern Italy. Conquest brought exposure, but also responsibility. Governing Greek-speaking populations required religious accommodation. Recognizing their gods as compatible with Roman ones helped maintain stability. This compatibility was reinforced by shared themes. Sky gods ruled through lightning, harvest goddesses governed grain, sea gods controlled storms. These functional similarities made alignment feel natural rather than forced. The stories differed, but the powers overlapped. At the same time, Rome remained cautious. Greek religion was rich, but it was also unpredictable. Stories of gods behaving impulsively or immorally did not sit easily with Roman expectations. As a result, Roman practice often separated myth from ritual. A god could be honored without fully embracing every story told about them. This selective adoption is crucial. Rome did not import Greek religion wholesale. It filtered it. Elements that supported order were emphasized. Elements that encouraged excess were muted. Over time, this filtering process produced Roman versions of Greek gods that felt familiar yet distinct. Magna Graecia thus became a testing ground. It showed Rome that Greek gods could coexist with Roman religious discipline. It also demonstrated that foreign cults could be integrated without undermining Roman identity. By the time Greek myth became fashionable among Roman poets and elites, the religious groundwork had already been laid. The gods were present. The rituals were established. Storytelling would follow, but it would follow paths already shaped by Roman priorities. This phase marks a turning point. Greek gods were no longer distant figures known only through intermediaries. They were part of Roman religious life, measured, regulated, and adapted. From this point onward, the conversation between Greek myth and Roman order would intensify. producing the blended pantheon that later generations would take for granted. What emerged was not confusion, but confidence. Rome had proven that it could engage deeply with foreign religion without losing control. That confidence would define how it approached not only Greek gods, but the countless divine powers encountered as the Roman world continued to expand. At the center of Rome's religious identity stood a grouping of divine powers so closely tied to the state that their worship became inseparable from Roman authority itself. These gods did not merely preside over aspects of life, they embodied Rome's understanding of order, legitimacy, and continuity. Their presence was not confined to temples alone, but woven into law, politics, and the idea of Rome as a divinely favored community. The most prominent of these figures was Jupiter. Although later writers would align him closely with the Greek Zeus, Jupiter's role in Roman life was shaped by expectations far more restrained and institutional. He was the guarantor of oaths, the witness to treaties, and the enforcer of justice on a cosmic scale. To swear falsely under Jupiter's gaze was not just immoral, it was dangerous. The stability of agreements, both public and private, depended on his authority. This emphasis on law and order distinguishes Jupiter from many Greek portrayals of Zeus. While Zeus ruled the gods, his myths often highlighted personal desire, conflict, and emotional reaction. Jupiter's authority, by contrast, was framed as steady and impersonal. He represented the permanence of Roman rule and the belief that the state itself operated under divine sanction. Jupiter's power was reinforced by ritual centrality. His cult occupied the most prominent sacred space in Rome. Public victories, political offices, and military triumphs were linked to his favor. In this way, Jupiter became the divine anchor of Roman public life, less a character in stories, and more a principle embodied in ritual. Alongside Jupiter stood Juno, whose role extended far beyond the sphere of marriage commonly associated with her Greek counterpart. Juno was protector, guardian, an embodiment of collective identity. She watched over women, yes, but also over the Roman people as a whole. Her many titles reflected these layers of responsibility, each emphasizing a different aspect of protection and continuity. While Greek narratives often portray Hera as reactive and jealous, Roman practice emphasized Juno's stabilizing presence. She was invoked in matters of childbirth, civic safety, and national preservation. Her concern was not personal rivalry but endurance. Through her, Rome imagined itself as a living entity requiring constant care. Minerva completed this triad. Identified with the Greek Athena, she shared associations with wisdom and strategy, but her Roman character leaned heavily toward applied knowledge. Minerva governed crafts, trades, and practical intelligence. She was the patron of skilled work, organized thought, and disciplined planning. This focus reveals much about Roman values. Intelligence was admired not as abstract brilliance, but as something that produced tangible results. Minerva's wisdom built cities, equipped armies, and sustained industry. Her presence affirmed that success came from preparation rather than impulse. Together, these three gods formed a divine reflection of Roman society itself. Jupiter represented authority and law. Juno embodied protection and continuity. Minerva stood for skill and disciplined intelligence. Their combined influence mirrored how Rome wished to see itself: ordered, enduring, and capable. Greek parallels provided narrative frameworks, but the Roman expressions of these gods were shaped by civic need. Myths were adapted, softened, or ignored as required. What mattered was not whether a story entertained, but whether worship maintained balance between divine power and human obligation. This triad illustrates a broader pattern that would repeat throughout Roman religion. When Greek gods were identified with Roman ones, the alignment emphasized shared function, not shared personality. Emotional complexity was secondary to reliability. Drama was secondary to duty. The prominence of these gods also reveals why Roman religion resisted fragmentation. By anchoring divine authority in a small number of central figures tied directly to the state, Rome ensured religious unity, even as new gods were introduced. Foreign cults could be added without threatening the core. Over time, poets and philosophers would explore these gods through Greek-influenced storytelling. Yet beneath those literary layers, the ritual reality remained stable. Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva were honored not because their stories were compelling, but because Rome believed its survival depended on them. Their presence reminds us that Roman religion was never merely about belief. It was about structure. The gods existed within a framework that mirrored the political order of the city. Authority flowed downward. Responsibility flowed upward. Harmony depended on each part fulfilling its role. Through this lens, the similarities between Roman and Greek gods appear less like imitation and more like translation. The names may echo older stories, but the meanings attached to them were distinctly Roman. This alignment of divine and civic order would shape how Rome understood every god it encountered thereafter. The pattern established here would guide the integration of war gods, fertility goddesses, household protectors, and foreign deities alike, all measured against the same standard. Did this god strengthen Rome's sense of order, legitimacy, and continuity? Among Rome's gods, none reveals the difference between Roman priorities and Greek storytelling more clearly than Mars. Later comparison would link him to the Greek Ares, yet this alignment obscures more than it explains. In Roman life, Mars was not a marginal or embarrassing figure. He stood near the center of identity, ancestry, and protection. To understand Mars is to understand how Rome viewed power, violence, and responsibility. Long before Greek influence reshaped Roman mythology, Mars already occupied a position of honor. He was associated not only with warfare, but with agriculture and seasonal renewal. This pairing may seem surprising at first, but it reflects an early Roman understanding of conflict as something tied to survival rather than spectacle. Fields had to be defended. Boundaries had to be maintained. Force existed to preserve order, not to glorify chaos. Mars was invoked as a protector of land and people. His domain included the strength required to repel threats and the discipline needed to maintain stability. In this sense, war was not viewed as an aberration from normal life, but as one of its necessary functions. Violence, when properly directed, served continuity. This outlook shaped Mars's character. He was not imagined primarily as impulsive or bloodthirsty. He represented controlled force, sanctioned by ritual and authority. Campaigns began and ended with religious observances tied to him. Soldiers did not merely fight. They participated in a sacred duty believed to be overseen by divine power. The public spaces associated with Mars reinforced this role. Training grounds, assemblies, and ritual sites dedicated to him existed on the edge of civic space, symbolically marking the transition between peace and conflict. These zones were carefully regulated. War was not allowed to spill unchecked into daily life. When Greek myths about Ares became known in Rome, they presented a contrast. Ares was often portrayed as disruptive, driven by rage and disliked even by other gods. These stories emphasized the destructive side of war rather than its necessity. Roman religion did not reject these myths outright, but it did not allow them to define Mars. Instead, Roman interpretation emphasized what Ares lacked in Greek storytelling: legitimacy. Mars was not an outsider among the gods. He was a foundational figure. Roman tradition connected him directly to the origins of the Roman people, reinforcing the idea that force, when guided by order, was woven into Rome's destiny. This connection between Mars and ancestry elevated him beyond the battlefield. He became a father figure, associated with protection and continuity across generations. War, in this framing, was not an expression of personal fury. It was a responsibility carried out on behalf of the community. Ritual reinforced this distinction. Ceremonies honoring Mars focused on purification, preparation, and closure. Weapons were consecrated. Soldiers were ritually cleansed. Victories were formally acknowledged. These acts framed war as a contained process with a beginning and an end, governed by rules rather than impulse. This emphasis on structure reflects Rome's broader approach to power. Authority was legitimate only when exercised within an accepted framework. Mars embodied this principle. He sanctioned force when it served order and punished disorder when it threatened stability. As Rome expanded, Mars's role grew with it. Military success was interpreted as evidence of divine favor. Defeat demanded explanation and ritual correction. The relationship between Mars and the Roman state became increasingly intimate, reinforcing the belief that Rome's rise was not accidental. Greek influence added narrative texture, but did not erase this core. Poets might explore dramatic encounters between gods, but ritual practice continued to frame Mars as a stabilizing presence. His identity remained anchored in civic duty rather than personal emotion. This difference explains why Mars never carried the same stigma in Rome that Ares often did in Greece. Roman culture did not need to distance itself from war. It needed to justify it. Mars provided that justification by embodying the idea that force, when disciplined, could be moral. The Roman treatment of Mars reveals a broader pattern in how Greek gods were adapted. Elements that conflicted with Roman values were softened or redirected. Elements that supported civic ideology were emphasized. The result was a god who shared a name and certain symbols with a Greek counterpart, yet functioned very differently within society. Through Mars, Rome articulated a vision of power that balanced necessity and restraint. War was acknowledged as destructive, but also as essential. The god who governed it was not a symbol of chaos, but of controlled strength. This vision would influence how Rome understood leadership, discipline, and legitimacy for centuries. Mars stood as a reminder that survival required force, but civilization required that force to be bound by law, ritual, and collective purpose. In this way, Mars becomes more than a war god. He becomes a mirror of Roman identity itself, disciplined, assertive, and committed to order above all else. Venus occupies a place in Roman religion that cannot be understood by equating her simply with Aphrodite. While later writers would draw obvious connections between the two, Venus's importance in Rome grew from concerns far broader than love or beauty. She became a figure through whom Romans explained fertility, victory, lineage, and destiny itself. In her, personal desire and public fate were bound together in a way that reflected Roman priorities. Before Greek influence deepened, Venus already existed in Italian religious life as a power connected to growth and cultivated land. Gardens, fields, and the quiet processes that sustained life fell under her care. This association with fertility was practical rather than romantic. It concerned continuation, abundance, and the conditions that allowed families and communities to endure. When Greek stories of Aphrodite entered Roman awareness, they introduced a more vivid and emotional portrait of divine love. Desire, attraction, and rivalry became central themes. Roman religion did not reject these elements, but it redirected them. Love was not treated as a disruptive force that undermined order. It was framed as a generative power capable of producing harmony, alliances, and legitimate succession. This redirection is most clearly seen in how Venus became linked to Roman ancestry. Through her association with Aeneas, Venus was positioned as a divine mother whose influence extended beyond individual relationships into the foundation of the Roman people themselves. Love, in this framing, was not merely personal, it was historical. It set events in motion that justified Rome's existence and future rule. By tying Venus to lineage, Roman tradition transformed her role. She became a guarantor of continuity across generations. Her favor ensured not only attraction and fertility, but survival and legitimacy. In this way, Venus's power aligned closely with Roman concerns about inheritance, family, and social stability. This alignment also explains why Venus became deeply entangled with political identity. Certain Roman families emphasized their connection to her to reinforce claims of divine favor. These associations were not symbolic flourishes. They were assertions that political authority rested on sacred foundations. Venus's presence elevated personal ambition into something ordained. In ritual practice, Venus was honored in ways that reflected this dual nature. She received devotion as a bringer of pleasure and harmony, but also as a protector of the Roman people. Her festivals balanced intimacy and public ceremony, acknowledging that private relationships and public order were inseparable. Greek mythological elements added narrative richness, but Roman interpretations softened their volatility. Stories of jealousy and rivalry were overshadowed by themes of protection and beneficence. Venus was not primarily a source of chaos. She was a stabilizing force whose influence encouraged cohesion. This shift reveals how Rome handled divine emotion. Passion was acknowledged, but it was expected to serve structure rather than undermine it. Venus embodied attraction that led to union, union that led to continuity, and continuity that supported the state. As Rome expanded, Venus's role expanded with it. She was invoked in matters of victory and peace alike. Love and war were not opposites in Roman thought. They were complementary forces. One secured loyalty and alliance, the other enforced order. Venus's influence extended into both realms, reinforcing her centrality. The Roman portrayal of Venus thus differs sharply from many Greek treatments of Aphrodite. Where Greek stories often explored the danger of desire, Roman tradition emphasized its necessity. Desire created bonds, bonds created families, families created Rome. This interpretation did not eliminate complexity. Venus remained a powerful and sometimes overwhelming presence, but her power was framed as purposeful. Even when desire caused disruption, it was ultimately understood as part of a larger pattern guiding Rome toward its destiny. Through Venus, Roman religion articulated a vision of love that was neither purely romantic nor purely destructive. It was foundational. It explained why people came together, why lineages continued, and why Rome itself endured. In this way, Venus stands as one of the clearest examples of Roman adaptation. Greek influence provided imagery and mythic language, but Roman values determined meaning. Love became history, beauty became legitimacy, desire became destiny. Beyond the gods most closely tied to Rome's political identity, a wider circle of divine powers governed the forces that sustained daily life and defined its limits. Sea and land, life and death, growth and decay, all fell under the care of gods whose Greek counterparts were well known, yet whose Roman forms reflected different anxieties and priorities. Neptune, Pluto, Ceres, and Vesta reveal how Rome adapted Greek models to manage fear, dependence, and continuity. Neptune's earliest presence in Roman religion was not centered on the open sea. Rome was not originally a maritime power, and its religious instincts reflected this. Neptune's domain focused on fresh water, rivers, springs, and the vital flow that sustained agriculture and settlement. Water was life-giving, but also dangerous. Floods and droughts alike demanded respect. When Greek stories of Poseidon entered Roman awareness, they brought with them an image of the sea as a realm of unpredictability and power. Rome did not resist this expansion of Neptune's identity. As Roman influence spread across the Mediterranean, the sea became central to trade, warfare, and communication. Neptune's authority expanded accordingly. Yet even as Neptune absorbed Poseidon's attributes, his Roman character remained restrained. He was not primarily portrayed as temperamental or vindictive. His power was acknowledged through ritual caution rather than dramatic storytelling. Storms were feared, but they were addressed through proper observance rather than mythic explanation. Pluto governed a realm even more unsettling. Death, in Roman thought, was not an abstract mystery. It was a constant presence tied to family memory, burial practice, and social order. Pluto's domain was approached with reverence and restraint. His name itself was often avoided, replaced with titles meant to soften his presence. Greek stories of Hades provided imagery of an underworld populated by judges, shades, and punishments. Roman religion absorbed these elements selectively. The underworld was acknowledged as structured and governed, but it was not a place for moral spectacle. The emphasis lay on boundary rather than drama. The dead belonged to a separate realm, and disturbing that separation was dangerous. Pluto's power reinforced the importance of proper rites. Burial practices, remembrance, and respect for ancestors were essential for maintaining balance between worlds. Fear was managed through order. Ritual ensured that the living and the dead remained in their proper places. Ceres addressed a different anxiety, dependence on the land. Grain was the foundation of Roman survival. Shortage meant unrest. Abundance meant stability. Ceres' worship focused on ensuring predictable cycles of planting and harvest. Her care was maternal but disciplined. Greek stories of Demeter introduced themes of loss and return, explaining seasonal change through narrative. Roman religion accepted these ideas, but emphasized their practical implications. Festivals honoring Ceres reinforced social unity and respect for labor. Hunger was not merely a personal hardship. It was a threat to civic order. Vesta occupied perhaps the most intimate position of all. Her presence was not tied to distant myth, but to the ever-burning hearth. Fire symbolized continuity, purity, and the survival of both household and state. To allow it to fail was to invite disaster. Greek parallels offered little that altered Vesta's core role. While Hestia shared similar associations, Roman practice elevated Vesta into a symbol of national endurance. Her sacred fire represented Rome's life force. As long as it burned, the city was believed to endure. The care of this fire was treated with extraordinary seriousness. Those entrusted with it were bound by strict rules and lifelong obligation. This was not devotion born of emotion, but of responsibility. Vesta demanded vigilance rather than affection. Together, these gods illustrate how Rome approached forces beyond human control. Water, death, food, and fire could not be dominated, but they could be managed through respect and ritual. Greek myth offered stories that explained these forces. Roman religion offered systems that contained them. Where Greek tradition often explored emotional responses to nature's power, Roman practice focused on regulation. Fear was acknowledged, but it was addressed through discipline. Dependence was accepted, but it was structured through collective obligation. This difference explains why Roman versions of these gods often feel quieter than their Greek counterparts. Their presence is less dramatic, but more constant. They are not sources of entertainment. They are guardians of balance. In adapting these gods, Rome reinforced a worldview in which survival depended on honoring boundaries. Sea and land, life and death, private and public, all required careful separation. The gods existed to uphold those separations. Through Neptune, Pluto, Ceres, and Vesta, Roman religion articulated a philosophy of restraint. Power was respected, not challenged. Danger was managed, not dramatized. Continuity was preserved through vigilance rather than passion. These gods remind us that Rome's religious system was designed not to inspire awe alone, but to sustain a civilization. Greek influence added language and imagery, but Roman values determined how those forces were ultimately understood and honored. Among all Roman gods, Janus stands apart as a figure with no true Greek counterpart. His presence reveals something essential about Roman religious thinking: an intense concern with boundaries, transitions, and the management of change. Where Greek religion often focused on events and personalities, Roman religion devoted careful attention to moments of passage. Janus existed to govern those moments. Janus was not associated with distant realms or dramatic myths. His power was immediate and practical. He presided over doorways, gates, thresholds, beginnings, and endings. Every transition, no matter how small, fell under his watch. To cross a threshold was to move from one state to another, and such movement required divine oversight. This emphasis reflects a Roman belief that change was inherently risky. Stability was valued, but change was unavoidable. Janus did not prevent change, he regulated it. By honoring him, Romans sought to ensure that transitions occurred smoothly, without disruption to order. His imagery reinforces this function. Janus was depicted with two faces, one looking forward and one looking back. This was not symbolism for contradiction, but for continuity. Every beginning emerged from something that came before. Every ending prepared the way for what followed. Janus held both perspectives at once. Greek religion offered gods of time and fate, but none filled this precise role. Greek myth tended to explain change through narrative conflict or divine intervention. Roman religion treated change as a process requiring management. Janus embodied that managerial instinct. His presence was woven into daily routine. Doors were sacred points. Gates marked the boundary between safety and danger. Even speech, when opening or closing a formal act, invoked his authority. He was the first god addressed in prayer, acknowledging that any request began with a transition from silence to speech. Janus's importance extended into public life. War and peace were framed as transitions under his care. His temple doors stood as symbols of Rome's state of conflict or calm. When open, they signaled active war. When closed, they proclaimed stability. This symbolism reinforced the idea that collective action required divine sanction at moments of change. Unlike many gods, Janus did not inspire elaborate mythological cycles. His power did not depend on dramatic stories, it depended on constant relevance. Every action began somewhere, every journey crossed a boundary. Janus was always present. This absence of myth is itself revealing. Roman religion did not require narrative excess to grant authority. Function alone was enough. Janus mattered because his domain was unavoidable. Life was a series of thresholds. The Roman fascination with beginnings is evident in their calendar as well. The first month was named for Janus, marking the turning of the year as a sacred passage. This reinforced the idea that time itself moved through gates that required divine oversight. In this way, Janus expresses a distinctly Roman worldview. History was not a chaotic flow of events. It was a sequence of managed transitions. Proper ritual ensured that movement from one state to another did not fracture order. As Rome encountered Greek philosophy and mythology, Janus remained unchanged. There was nothing to translate. His role was already complete. Greek culture enriched Roman religion in many ways, but it did not replace Rome's concern with thresholds. Janus reminds us that Roman religion was not solely about gods as personalities. It was about systems. It addressed how societies move, adapt, and survive change without collapse. By honoring Janus, Romans affirmed that beginnings mattered as much as outcomes. That careful preparation was as important as decisive action. That stability depended not only on strength, but on respect for process. This focus on transitions shaped Roman law, ritual, and political life. Authority was exercised through formal beginnings. Decisions were marked by openings and closures. Nothing important occurred without acknowledgement of passage. Through Janus, Roman religion articulated a philosophy of controlled change. Progress was possible, but only when guided. Transformation was acceptable, but only when bounded by order. In a pantheon filled with adapted figures and translated powers, Janus stands as a reminder that Rome did not define itself by imitation. It defined itself by what it chose to protect, and among the most important things Rome protected was the fragile space between what had been and what was yet to come. As Rome extended its reach across the Mediterranean and beyond, its religious system faced a challenge unlike any before. Conquest brought contact with countless local gods, each tied to a people's land, memory, and identity. Rome's response was neither blanket suppression nor uncritical adoption. It was interpretation. Through a process later described as interpretatio Romana, Rome aligned foreign gods with its own, integrating them into a framework that preserved order while allowing diversity. This approach rested on a simple assumption: divine power was universal, even if names and stories differed. A god who protected a river in Gaul or a mountain in Iberia was not alien in essence. That God could be understood as another expression of a power Rome already recognized. By naming that power in Roman terms, Rome brought it within its religious and political orbit. The benefits of this system were practical. Conquered peoples could continue honoring their gods without feeling erased. Roman authorities, in turn, could claim divine continuity rather than rupture. The gods of the empire were many, but they were understood to operate within a single cosmic order overseen by Rome. Soldiers played a crucial role in this exchange. As armies moved, they encountered local cults and carried those practices with them. Certain gods gained popularity because they traveled well. They promised protection, healing, or favor in uncertain conditions. When such gods proved reliable, they were readily identified with Roman counterparts and absorbed into broader worship. This mobility transformed Roman religion into a living system rather than a fixed canon. New cults appeared, evolved, and sometimes faded, all without destabilizing the core. The central gods tied to Roman authority remained intact, while the surrounding divine landscape shifted with circumstance. At the same time, Rome's political structure reshaped religious expression. Emperors came to be honored not merely as rulers but as figures bound to divine favor. This did not replace traditional worship overnight. Instead, it layered political loyalty onto existing religious instincts. Honoring the emperor became a way of affirming participation in the Roman order. This development marked a subtle but significant shift. Divine power was no longer associated only with distant gods or abstract forces. It was reflected in the living structure of the state. Authority, stability, and prosperity were increasingly seen as signs of divine alignment with Roman rule. Greek philosophy and later religious movements challenged this worldview, questioning the nature of the gods and the morality of worship. Yet even as intellectual currents shifted, traditional practices endured. Ritual continued, calendars remained in use, temples stood as markers of continuity. Over time, the old gods lost political centrality, but they did not vanish. Their names survived in language, art, and concept. Planets bore their identities. Weeks and months echoed their influence. Stories persisted, reshaped to suit new audiences. What ultimately faded was not belief in divine power, but the Roman method of managing it. As new religious frameworks emerged, the emphasis moved away from ritual precision and civic balance toward personal conviction. The ancient system, built for a city and then an empire, gave way to models suited to different social realities. Yet the legacy of Roman adaptation remains unmistakable. The way modern culture speaks about gods, power, and authority still carries Roman assumptions. The idea that different traditions describe the same forces in different languages is a Roman inheritance. Looking back, the Roman gods are best understood not as imitations of Greek originals, but as results of long negotiation. Rome encountered Greece, absorbed its myths, and reshaped them through a lens of order, duty, and continuity. It did the same with countless other cultures, building a religious system capable of expansion without collapse. This ability to translate rather than erase was one of Rome's greatest strengths. It allowed an empire of extraordinary diversity to imagine itself as unified under shared divine principles. In the end, the Roman gods tell a story not just about belief, but about governance. They reveal how a society understood power, managed change, and justified its place in the world. The names may echo Greece, but the meanings belong to Rome. And through those meanings, Rome's vision of order continues to shape how the ancient world is remembered. If you found this journey through ancient Rome helpful or calming, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more long-form stories designed to be listened to slowly. Until next time, rest well.